This is my first of a series of videos comparing presidential performance of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. As most of us know, later this year Biden and Trump will once again compete for the presidency of the United States. This rematch is not ideal, as both presidents are among the most unpopular in the last half-century. I will compare and discuss their approval ratings in another video. But this rematch is big news today, and so we can expect many articles and videos in the next few months stating why Presidents Biden or Trump should return to the Oval Office in January. An example of one of these videos was published on YouTube March 13, 2024 by Chris Hayes of MSNBC. This video, called Must See, Trump v. Biden in 21 Charts, was taken from Hayes' show All In with Chris Hayes. In the video description, they state, Chris Hayes breaks down the apples-to-apples comparison of Trump's record versus Biden's record. These are just the facts, says Hayes. Initially, this video appealed to me because it claimed to be data-driven, just the facts in their words. I do not watch Hayes' show, so I'm unfamiliar with his style of journalism, but I watched the video because I wanted to see the data. Before I dig into the data, I want to briefly comment as a non-journalist evaluating the video for fairness and impartiality. MSNBC has a reputation in recent years of being a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party. This video does not disprove that reputation. In my opinion, it was clear from the start that the purpose of this video was to convince you that Joe Biden deserves a second term. Less than a minute into this 9-minute video, Hayes states about Trump he catastrophically bungled the response to a once-in-a-century pandemic and left in disgrace having fulminated an unsuccessful coup and getting impeached for it. Leading into the data, Hayes then goes on to say, and how are things now 4 years later under this president, Joe Biden? There is quite a story to tell about the general trajectory of American life over the last 4 years. The clear indication is the data will show why things are better since President Trump left office. Before I get into the data, I have a few disclaimers. First, I do not support Trump or Biden. I have issues with both candidates, and I am disappointed that once again our general election will be a contest between these two men. I think we can do better, but here we are. All we can do now is fairly evaluate both candidates based on their record. Second, it's probably clear now that I have no formal training in journalism or video editing. I have done my best to prepare a concise rebuttal to Hayes' video, but any shortcomings to my presentation are mine alone. What I do have is a background in numbers and empirical analysis. As the channel suggests, I was an engineer for about 15 years, so I have a head for numbers. I also have a master's degree in political science, and my thesis research was based on data-driven analysis of presidential approval. I will explore that research in later videos, but for now I will focus on Hayes' video. The 21 charts included in Hayes' video cover a range of topics from gross domestic product to job numbers to crime statistics. To limit the scope of this video, I will focus on GDP. Some of the other charts will be covered in future videos. Now on to the data. The first thing that stood out to me while watching Hayes' video was that it was not an apples-to-apples comparison as claimed. Here is a screenshot from Hayes' video showing GDP as a function of quarter. At the bottom of the video is the description where apples to apples is highlighted. The data starts with the first quarter 2020 as the COVID pandemic was taking hold. The data shows a sharp downward spike followed by more than 3 years of continuous growth, implying the economy was bad under Trump and better under Biden, but an apples-to-apples comparison would have included all the GDP data for Trump. When the data for the entire Trump presidency is included, the context is different. GDP grew continuously during the first 3 years of the Trump administration. Along with including all of the data for both presidents, changing the formatting changes the message almost completely. First, I have added vertical grid lines and markers on the data series. I find this clarifies the data. Second, I increased the number of labels along the bottom axis from once a year to once a quarter. Finally, I add headers to show exactly when the Trump administration ends and the Biden administration begins. These changes clarify exactly what the data says. What immediately stands out to me is that the economy had mostly recovered from COVID in the fourth quarter of 2020, before Trump left office. GDP for Q4 2019 was $21,902 billion. At the bottom of the spike in Q2 2020, GDP dropped to $19,913 billion. But by Q4 2020, a year after the pandemic started, GDP had increased to $22,025 billion. This is a $122 billion increase over the pre-COVID economy. During the first 3 years of the Trump administration, GDP grew at an average 1.17% per quarter. If our economy had grown at the same rate during 2020, the worst of COVID, GDP would have reached $22,940 billion by the time Trump left office. This is about $1 trillion of potential growth that was never realized due to COVID. One can argue that the Trump administration possibly could have done more to counter the impact of COVID on our economy. But the data shows that our economy recovered all of the losses due to COVID before Trump left office. Back to Mr. Hayes' video. As part of his argument for how well President Biden handled the post-COVID economy, Hayes shows a plot comparing our GDP growth to other nations. In his words, last year our economy grew faster than any other nation in the G7. I will attempt to find and analyze the G7 data in another video. But there are a couple points with Hayes' statements that should be addressed. First, Hayes continues to only give credit for the COVID recovery to President Biden. He says, when you zoom in a little further, now only showing the Biden years, it's essentially a straight line going up. That was not foreordained. A lot could have gone wrong. It's hard to pick yourself back up after a once-in-a-century pandemic and the disruptions. I agree with Hayes' statement that recovering from a pandemic is a significant challenge. The problem I have with his statement is the data shows we'd already picked ourselves back up before Biden took office. My second concern with Hayes' presentation is that he uses GDP when discussing our economy by itself, but he uses real GDP when comparing us to the G7. GDP and real GDP are not the same thing. GDP is the total value of goods and services produced by a nation during a specific time period. Real GDP is the total value of goods and services produced by a nation during a specific time period, adjusted by inflation. This is an important distinction. Economists use GDP or real GDP depending on their analysis objectives. However, in general, GDP is used for short-term analysis, and real GDP is used for long-term analysis. Since we are comparing economic performance for both Trump and Biden over a period of more than 7 years, real GDP is a better metric. Lucky for us, the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the source for Hayes' GDP data, publishes both GDP and real GDP in the same report. This plot adds real GDP to what we've already seen, shown in green. Compared to GDP, real GDP paints a more somber picture of our economy. Since President Biden took office, during Biden's 3 years in office, our GDP increased from $22 trillion to $27.9 trillion. This represents a 23.6% growth to our economy, or roughly 7.9% per year. During that same period, real GDP increases from $20.7 trillion to $22.7 trillion. This represents an 8% growth to the economy, or roughly 2.7% per year. During Trump's first 3 years, the GDP grew from $19.3 trillion to $21.9 trillion. This is approximately 13.6% growth, or roughly 4.5% per year. During that same time period, real GDP increased from $19.4 trillion to $21.0 trillion. That is, wait for it, 8% growth, or roughly 2.7% per year. The GDP growth rate during the first 3 years under Trump and Biden was exactly the same. If your goal is to indicate Biden's performance is superior to Trump's, it's clear why you would use GDP over real GDP. Hayes says when the data is only showing the Biden years, it's essentially a straight line going up. This is not true if you look at real GDP. Real GDP shrank twice during Biden's second year in office. Between Q4 2021 and Q1 2022, real GDP shrank by 0.5%. Between Q1 2022 and Q2 2022, real GDP shrank by another 0.1%. Between Q2 and Q3 2022, real GDP grew by 0.6%, which only recovered what was lost during the previous 2 quarters. Over 3 quarters or 9 months during the Biden administration, the economy was stagnant. I find this important for 2 reasons. First, it shows inflation matters. If inflation grows at the same time as GDP, the American people do not benefit. I will make another video soon showing how inflation impacts the economy. But the second reason I find this important is I don't think it was an accident how Hayes presented the data. As I stated earlier, I think Hayes made it clear from the start of his video that he intended to show why Biden's record was better. But I think if one looks at all of the data, the story is different. Real GDP growth during the first 3 years of both presidents' terms was effectively identical. The only wild card is COVID in 2020. Whether you support him or not, Trump gets the lion's share of the blame or credit for how the economy performed during the COVID pandemic. Hayes made his opinions clear. In his words, Trump catastrophically bungled the response. But I don't think the data supports that claim. The economy took a hit, but it was on the road to recovery in the last half of 2020 before Biden took office. I think it is reasonable to assume there will be a negative impact to our economy when whole industries were deemed non-essential and the workers sent home. I will make another video showing how COVID policy impacted the economy, both before and after President Biden took office. I think if we get into the weeds, we will find the answer is much more complicated than Trump equals bad, Biden equals good. To give President Biden credit, the economy during 2023 grew during all 4 quarters, with the real GDP growing at 3.1% annually. This is good, but it has not been good during his entire term. If Hayes were presenting a news piece rather than a campaign ad, this would be clear. One final point. Maybe this was intended to be a campaign ad for President Biden. I did not see anything in the video specifically stating it was a paid ad from the Biden re-election campaign. But during most of the video, the background has a bunch of Biden-Harris campaign posters. Also, maybe it's a coincidence, but the first few times I watched Hayes' video on YouTube, it was preceded by an actual Biden campaign ad requesting a donation. Go figure. With our presidential election less than a year away, I think we should all take the time to inform ourselves on what Biden and Trump have accomplished. Don't take my word for any of the data presented in my video. All of the data in both mine and Mr. Hayes' analysis is publicly accessible through the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I confirmed with my own analysis that the GDP data Hayes presented is accurate. However, it is incomplete and I don't think this was an accident. I think Mr. Hayes made his intentions clear in the video. I appreciate anyone who took the time to watch this video. Please like and or subscribe if you think it helped clarify anything regarding this complicated subject. Also, if I made any mistakes or if you disagree with any of my assumptions, please comment and I will make any corrections as quickly as possible. If necessary, I will make a subsequent video to clarify, correct, or expand the topic. Thank you.